December 14, 1944, the Philippine island of Palawan. 150 American prisoners of war were ordered into their air raid shelters. They'd been building a Japanese airstrip for 2 years. Beaten, starved, worked like animals. They thought it was just another drill. Then the Japanese soldiers came with buckets of gasoline. They doused the entrances to the shelters and threw in lit torches. The Americans trapped inside burst into flames. Those who managed to claw their way out, clothes and skin on fire, were met with machine gun fire. The wounded were bayoneted. Some were tortured, fingers and toes set ablaze one by one while guards laughed. 139 Americans died screaming that afternoon. 11 men somehow escaped into the jungle. They swam across the bay and reached Filipino guerrillas who smuggled them to safety. And when their reports reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, everything changed, because there was another camp, a bigger camp, 500 Americans still alive at Cabanatuan, survivors of the Bataan Death March who had been rotting in that hellhole for nearly 3 years. And now MacArthur knew exactly what the Japanese planned to do to them. He had weeks, maybe days. What happened next would become the most successful prisoner rescue in American military history, a mission so audacious that MacArthur himself would call it the incident of this campaign that has given me the most satisfaction. This is the story of 120 men who volunteered to die so that 500 could live. Before we go any further, if you're not subscribed, now's the time. This channel covers the most insane true stories from military history, and trust me, this one only gets more incredible. Hit subscribe, you won't regret it. Now, to understand why this rescue mattered so much, we need to go back to the beginning, to the worst defeat in American military history. April 1942. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Philippines were falling. American and Filipino forces, abandoned by Washington and starving, had retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, a jungle-covered finger of land pointing into Manila Bay. For 3 months, they held out against overwhelming Japanese forces. They called themselves the Battling Bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. But there was no rescue coming. America had decided to focus on Hitler first. The Pacific would have to wait. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers to the Japanese. It was the largest surrender in American military history. What followed was worse than the battle itself. The Japanese had planned for 25,000 prisoners. They got 75,000. There wasn't enough food, water, or transportation for a fraction of that number. So they marched them. 60 miles, in tropical heat that reached 100 degrees, with no food, no water, no rest. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Men who asked for water were shot. Men who tried to help fallen comrades were beaten to death. The Japanese called it a transfer. History calls it the Bataan Death March. By the time the survivors reached their destination, a camp called O'Donnell, an estimated 10,000 Filipinos and 650 Americans were dead. Thousands more would die in the camp over the following weeks from disease, starvation, and execution. The survivors were eventually transferred to a larger facility, a place that would become synonymous with American suffering in the Pacific, Cabanatuan. The camp sat in a valley in Nueva Ecija province, about 60 miles north of Manila. It had been a Philippine Army training facility before the war. Now, it was a death factory. At its peak, Cabanatuan held over 8,000 American prisoners. The conditions were beyond description. The men slept in bamboo barracks crawling with lice, bedbugs, and rats. Dysentery swept through the camp in waves, killing dozens at a time. Malaria, beriberi, pellagra, diseases that American doctors had barely seen in decades, became everyday killers. Food was a cup of rice per day, if you were lucky. The rice was often contaminated, filled with weevils and rat droppings. Men caught eating banana peels from the garbage were beaten. Men caught stealing food were executed. There was a section of the camp the prisoners called the Zero Ward. Zero was your probability of getting out alive. It was where they sent you to die. The Japanese guards were brutal. Beatings were constant. Men were forced to stand at attention for hours in the blazing sun. Escape attempts meant execution, not just for the escapee, but for 9 other prisoners chosen at random. By December 1944, over 3,000 Americans had died at Cabanatuan. The Japanese had shipped most of the healthy prisoners to Japan to work as slave labor. What remained were approximately 500 men, the sickest, the weakest, the ones too broken to be useful. Skeletons held together by skin, men missing limbs from gangrene, men who weighed 80 pounds and couldn't walk across the courtyard without help. They had been there for almost 3 years. Most had given up hope of ever being rescued. What they didn't know was that American forces had landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945. MacArthur was back, just as he'd promised. The liberation of the Philippines had begun. But the prisoners also didn't know about the orders that Japanese commanders had received from Tokyo. Kill them all before the Americans arrive. And after what happened at Palawan, everyone knew those orders would be carried out. December 14, 1944. Puerto Princesa, Palawan Island. The 150 Americans at Camp 10A had spent 2 years building an airstrip with their bare hands, breaking coral, clearing jungle, pouring concrete, all while being beaten, starved, and worked to exhaustion. That morning, the guards seemed different, agitated, short-tempered. At noon, air raid sirens wailed, but there were no American planes in the sky. The prisoners were herded into 3 long trenches they had dug weeks earlier as air raid shelters. Each trench held about 50 men, packed tight, with only small openings at each end. For an hour, nothing happened. The guards stood watch, rifles ready. Then 5 soldiers approached the first trench carrying buckets. They poured gasoline into the entrances. 2 others threw lit torches. The men inside became human torches. Their screams echoed across the camp as they clawed at the dirt, trying to escape. 7 men managed to break free, their clothes and skin on fire. A Japanese officer ordered a machine gunner to cut them down. The guards moved to the 2nd and 3rd trenches. More gasoline, more torches, more screaming. Some prisoners managed to dig out through the back of their shelters toward a cliff at the edge of the camp. They jumped, they ran, they crawled into the jungle with their flesh burned away. Japanese hunting parties went after them. They found wounded Americans hiding in the rocks, in the trees, in the water. They bayoneted them, shot them, tortured them. One survivor, hiding nearby, watched Japanese soldiers torture a wounded American with bayonets, then set his feet on fire one at a time while he begged to be shot. When he collapsed, they doused him with gasoline and burned him alive. Of the 150 prisoners, 139 died that afternoon. 11 men made it to the water. They swam across the bay in the darkness, bleeding from wounds, their burns blistering in the salt water. Filipino guerrillas found them and smuggled them to safety. Their reports reached MacArthur's headquarters in early January 1945, and everything changed. MacArthur knew the Japanese playbook now. As his forces advanced, every POW camp became a potential massacre site. The 500 Americans at Cabanatuan were less than 25 miles from the front lines. He gave the order, "Get them out, whatever it takes." January 27, 1945, 6th Army Headquarters, Dagupan, Philippines. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger summoned his intelligence officer, Colonel Horton White, and laid out the situation. Cabanatuan was 30 miles behind Japanese lines. The camp held approximately 500 American POWs, survivors of Bataan, Corregidor, and countless horrors. Intelligence suggested over 7,000 Japanese troops were in the area, including a division-sized force in Cabanatuan City just 5 miles away. Another 1,000 were camped along the Kabu River, less than half a mile from the prison itself. A conventional assault was impossible. By the time American forces fought their way through, the prisoners would be dead. But there was another option. White recommended the 6th Rangers Battalion, a small elite unit that had been training for exactly this kind of mission. Send them behind enemy lines, hit the camp fast and hard, get the prisoners out before the Japanese knew what happened. Kruger approved the mission. He gave one instruction: bring them home. White gathered the commanders who would make it happen. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, the 6th Rangers commanding officer, Captain Robert Prince, who would lead the assault force, and 3 lieutenants from the Alamo Scouts, the 6th Army's Special Reconnaissance Unit that would scout the target. They studied aerial photographs taken just days earlier. They reviewed guerrilla intelligence on guard positions, patrol routes, and prisoner locations. The plan began to take shape. But there was a problem, the same problem that made this mission nearly impossible. The last 800 yards to the cap were completely open. No trees, no cover, nothing but flat rice paddies and vegetable fields that the Japanese had deliberately cleared to prevent escape attempts. Colonel Mucci looked at the photographs and shook his head. How we're going to infiltrate the area around that POW camp even at twilight when the approach has about as much cover as a billiard table? They had no answer. Not yet. The 6th Ranger Battalion had a strange origin story. They started as the 98th Field Artillery Battalion, mule skinners who led pack mules carrying heavy weapons through the mountains of New Guinea. When the Army decided mules were obsolete, they kept the men and turned them into Rangers. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci transformed them. West Point graduate, hard as nails, he trained them in hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, night operations, and small unit tactics. By January 1945, they were one of the most capable special operations units in the Pacific. Mucci called his men together and explained the mission. 30 miles behind enemy lines, a camp surrounded by thousands of Japanese, prisoners who were too weak to walk, let alone run. Then he asked for volunteers. "I need men who will die fighting rather than let harm come to those prisoners." Every single ranger stepped forward. Mucci selected 120 men, 90 from C Company under Captain Robert Prince, and 30 from F Company's 2nd Platoon under Lieutenant John Murphy. Prince would lead the main assault on the front gate. Murphy would take his platoon around to the rear of the camp and hit the back entrance simultaneously. The guards would be caught in a crossfire with no idea which direction the attack was coming from. But they couldn't do it alone. The Rangers would be supported by 14 Alamo Scouts who would reconnoiter the target 24 hours in advance. And they would link up with Filipino guerrilla forces who knew the terrain, the enemy positions, and the local population. 2 guerrilla commanders would prove essential: Captain Juan Pachoda, whose 200 fighters would set up a blocking position at the Kabu River Bridge, and Captain Eduardo Hoson, whose 75 men would block the road from Cabanatuan City. Without the guerrillas, the mission was suicide. The attack was set for January 29, 1945. Then everything changed. January 28, 1945. The Alamo Scouts reached their observation point outside Cabanatuan and reported back with bad news. A Japanese division was moving through the area. Thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery pieces were passing within sight of the prison camp. The road was clogged with enemy vehicles day and night. Lieutenant Thomas Rounseville radioed Colonel Mucci. A Jap division was moving past all night until it shut down at dawn to hide out from planes during the day. Our bacon will be out for frying if we collide with those bastards. Mucci made a hard decision. Postpone the raid 24 hours. Let the division pass. It was agony. Every hour of delay was another hour the Japanese might decide to kill the prisoners. But attacking into a Japanese division would get everyone killed, Rangers and POWs alike. Captain Pahota, the Filipino guerrilla leader, supported the delay. He also had an idea for that impossible 800-yard approach. Pahota had noticed something. Whenever American aircraft flew over the camp, the Japanese guards became transfixed. They watched the sky even after the planes had passed. What if they arranged a distraction, an aircraft that would capture the guards' attention while the Rangers crawled into position? Mucci loved it. He contacted 6th Army Headquarters, who reached the 547th Night Fighter Squadron at Lingayen. Captain Kenneth Schreiber and Lieutenant Bonnie Rux volunteered to fly a P-61 Black Widow, a massive twin-engine night fighter, over the camp at the exact moment the Rangers needed to cross that open ground. But they wouldn't just fly over, they would put on a show. The plan was set for January 30, 1945. At 5 p.m., the Rangers would begin their final approach. At 6:40 p.m., the P-61 would arrive and distract the guards. At 7:40 p.m., the attack would begin. They had 30 minutes to kill every guard, rescue every prisoner, and get out before Japanese reinforcements arrived. If anything went wrong, if the guards weren't distracted, if the guerrillas couldn't hold the bridges, if the prisoners couldn't be moved fast enough, they would all die together. January 28, 1945, 1400 hours. 120 Rangers moved out from their base at Gimba, beginning a 30-mile march through enemy-held territory. They traveled light, weapons, ammunition, water, and basic medical supplies, nothing else. Every ounce of extra weight could mean the difference between life and death. The first miles were easy, friendly territory with Filipino civilians waving from their homes. But as darkness fell and they crossed into Japanese-controlled areas, everything changed. They moved in silence, no talking, no coughing, hand signals only. The route took them through rice paddies, across rivers, and past barrios where Japanese patrols could appear at any moment. Filipino guides from Pahota's guerrilla force led the way, finding paths that avoided enemy positions. At one point, the column halted as 10 Japanese tanks rumbled past on a nearby road, their engines growling in the darkness. The Rangers pressed themselves into ditches, barely breathing, as the tanks passed within yards of their position. Another time, 6 trucks loaded with Japanese soldiers rolled by. The Rangers could hear the soldiers talking, laughing. One cigarette, one flashlight, one careless noise would have revealed them. At midnight, they forded the Talavera River, a waist-deep obstacle that soaked their equipment and chilled them to the bone. Then they double-timed for a mile to make up lost time, only to slow again when they nearly stumbled into a Japanese tank parked at an intersection. By dawn on January 29th, the Rangers reached Balancadine, a small barrio where they linked up with the Alamo Scouts and the guerrilla forces. The Scouts had been watching the prison camp from a nipa hut about 200 yards from the main gate. They had detailed information on guard positions, patrol schedules, and the location of the prisoners. But they also had more bad news. The Japanese division was still passing through. The raid would have to wait another 24 hours. The Rangers spent January 29th hiding in the barrio, resting and refining their plans. The local Filipino population, knowing the risks, fed them, hid them, and said nothing to the Japanese patrols that passed through. One more night, one more day, then they would attack. January 30th, 1945, the day of the raid. The Rangers gathered for final briefings. Captain Prince walked them through the assault plan one more time. Murphy's 30 men would approach from the east, following a dry creek bed that ran under the highway and along the camp's perimeter. They would attack the rear gate simultaneously with the main assault. Prince's 90 men would approach from the south, crawling across the open ground to reach positions near the front gate. On signal, they would destroy the guard towers, breach the gate, and pour into the camp. Pojota's 200 guerrillas would hold the Kabu River Bridge to the northeast. If the 1,000 Japanese troops camped across that river came to help, Pojota had to stop them cold. Joseon's 75 guerrillas would block the road from Cabanatuan City to the southwest. If any of the 7,000 troops there responded, Joseon had to buy time. Both guerrilla units would plant landmines in front of their positions. Both would have bazookas to stop vehicles. Colonel Mucci made one thing absolutely clear. Remember, all of the prisoners go. No one is left behind, not a single one. Then he addressed the problem everyone was thinking about. The last 800 yards. 8 football fields of completely open ground. No trees, no ditches deep enough to hide in. Just flat rice paddies that the Japanese had cleared specifically to prevent escape. In daylight, they would be spotted instantly. Even at twilight, any alert guard would see 90 men crawling toward the camp. Their only hope was the P-61 Black Widow. At 4 p.m., the Rangers moved out from Platero, their final staging area. They crossed the line of departure at 1600 hours and began moving through the tall grass toward the camp, 3 kilometers away. At first, the grass was high enough to conceal them. They moved in 3 columns, Joseon's guerrillas on the right, Pojota's men on the left, Rangers in the center. By 6 p.m., they had broken through the tall grass. Ahead of them, less than a mile away, they could see the guard towers of Cabanatuan. And between them and those towers, nothing but open ground. Mucci gave the order. Start crawling. 6:40 p.m. Right on schedule. The P-61 Black Widow appeared in the sky, its twin engines roaring as it dropped toward the prison camp. The guards heard it first. Then they saw it, a massive black aircraft flying impossibly low, barely clearing the treetops. Every Japanese guard in the camp stopped what they were doing and stared upward. Captain Schreiber cut power to the left engine. The aircraft shuddered, dropped altitude, and began trailing smoke. To the guards below, it looked like a plane about to crash. The Japanese watched, waiting for the explosion. Schreiber restarted the engine at the last moment, pulled up, and circled back. Then he did it again, cutting the engine, dropping low, looking like he was about to crash into the camp itself. 3 times he performed this routine. Each time, every guard in the compound watched the sky, convinced they were about to witness an American aircraft slam into the ground. They never looked down. They never saw the 90 American soldiers crawling toward their front gate. Lieutenant Nellist, watching from the Nipa hut across the road, saw the P-61 make its passes. He just about ripped the shingles off that damn prison camp. He came by several times and really buzzed it. The distraction worked perfectly. By 7:25 p.m., Company C was in position, 20 yards from the front gate, concealed in a small drainage ditch. Murphy's platoon had negotiated the creek bed and was in position on the east side, ready to hit the rear entrance. The guerrillas were at their blocking positions on both bridges. Everything was set. Colonel Mucci checked his watch. 7:40 p.m. Time to go. The final approach had taken 3 hours. 3 hours of crawling on their bellies through rice paddies and vegetable fields. 3 hours of inching forward, yard by yard, while guard towers loomed overhead. The Rangers moved in a low crawl, faces in the dirt, rifles cradled in their arms, pushing forward with their elbows and knees. Every man was drenched in sweat. Every man's heart was pounding. Private First Class Leland Provencher was barely out of his teens. This was his first real combat, but he'd been trained so thoroughly that his body moved automatically. We were so well coached and so well drilled that everything just fell in line instinctively. They couldn't see the prisoners. They couldn't see what they were risking their lives for. All they could see was the next few feet of ground and the guard towers that could kill them all with a single burst of machine gun fire. Inside the camp, the 500 prisoners had no idea rescue was coming. Some were too sick to leave their barracks. Some sat in the dirt, too weak to move. Some lay in the zero ward, waiting to die. They had seen the P-61 buzzing the camp and assumed it was just another American reconnaissance flight, another tease, another reminder that the war was going on somewhere without them. They had given up hope long ago. At 7:25 p.m., Captain Prince and Company C reached their final position, a shallow ditch on the north side of the highway, just 20 yards from the main gate. The gate was padlocked. 3 guard towers overlooked it, plus 1 pillbox with a machine gun. Prince could see the guards in the towers. He could see the barracks where the prisoners were kept. He could smell the camp, the stench of disease and death that hung over everything. 20 yards, the distance from home plate to first base. He waited. At 7:40 p.m. exactly, a single rifle shot cracked across the compound. It was the signal. The shot came from Murphy's position at the rear of the camp. Within 15 seconds, every guard tower and pillbox was neutralized. The Rangers' fire was devastating, concentrated, accurate, overwhelming. Guards who had been watching the sky moments before were cut down before they could raise their weapons. At the front gate, Sergeant Ted Richardson sprinted forward with his .45 caliber pistol. 2 Japanese guards suddenly appeared and fired at him, knocking the pistol from his hand. Private Provencher killed one of them instantly. Richardson grabbed his Tommy gun and killed the other. He recovered his .45, aimed at the padlock on the gate, and fired. The lock shattered. The gate swung open. Lieutenant William O'Connell's first assault element surged through the opening, followed by the weapons section. The second element hit the fence line simultaneously, pouring fire into the guard barracks and officers' quarters. Bazooka teams targeted a shed suspected of containing tanks. The building exploded. Japanese soldiers attempting to flee in 2 trucks were cut down. The trucks burst into flames. Inside the camp, the noise was deafening. Gunfire, explosions, screaming. The prisoners didn't know what was happening. Some thought the Japanese were massacring them, just like Palawan. Then they heard American voices. "We're Yanks! We're here to get you out!" Staff Sergeant Manton Stewart ran toward the prisoner barracks, shouting, "You're free! Head for the main gate!" The prisoners couldn't process it. Men who had spent 3 years believing they would die in this camp stared at American soldiers like they were ghosts. "Am I dreaming?" one man asked. "Is this really happening?" Stewart grabbed him by the shoulders. "It's happening! Now move!" Lieutenant Prince reached the hospital area, the zero ward, and found men too weak to stand. Skeletons wrapped in rags, covered in sores, missing limbs. "Can you walk?" he asked one man. "I don't think so." "Then I'll carry you." All over the camp, Rangers were hoisting prisoners onto their backs, lifting them in their arms, helping them hobble toward the gate. Some prisoners weighed less than 90 pounds. Some couldn't see. Some couldn't hear. Some had no idea where they were or what was happening. But every single one was getting out. That was the order. No one left behind. The assault had taken less than 15 minutes. Over 200 Japanese guards were dead. The guard towers were destroyed, the barracks were burning, and 500 American prisoners were streaming toward the front gate, supported by Rangers who refused to let them fall. But the mission was only half complete. Getting the prisoners out of the camp was one thing. Getting them 25 miles back to American lines, through enemy territory, in the darkness, with 500 men who could barely walk, was something else entirely. At the gate, Filipino guerrillas waited with carabao carts, simple wooden wagons pulled by water buffalo. 26 carts had been arranged in advance, but as the prisoners emerged, it became clear that wasn't enough. The prisoners were in worse condition than anyone had imagined. Men collapsed just outside the gate, their bodies giving out after the effort of walking 100 yards. Men who had stayed alive through sheer willpower for 3 years suddenly had nothing left. Ranger Corporal Jim Herrick picked up one prisoner, a naked skeleton who weighed almost nothing, and started running toward the river. He made it about 100 yards before the man gasped and went limp in his arms. He had died, within sight of freedom. But there was no time to stop. Japanese reinforcements would be coming. The column had to move. Prince fired a red flare, the signal that all prisoners were out of the camp. The guerrillas would now begin their withdrawal, covering the Rangers' flanks. But at the Kabu River Bridge, all hell was breaking loose. Captain Juan Pahota had promised Colonel Mucci 30 minutes. He gave him more than that. When the shooting started at the camp, the 1,000 Japanese troops across the Kabu River responded immediately. They came running toward the bridge, infantry, vehicles, everything they had. Pahota's 200 guerrillas were waiting. They had blown a section of the bridge earlier, making it impassable to vehicles. They had planted landmines on the approaches, and they had positioned themselves on the friendly side of the river with overlapping fields of fire. When the Japanese reached the bridge, Pahota's men opened up. The initial assault was slaughtered. Dozens of Japanese soldiers fell in the first minutes, but more kept coming, trying to push across the damaged bridge or wade across the river. Pahota's men held their ground. For over an hour they fought a desperate defensive action against an enemy that outnumbered them 5-1. They burned through their ammunition, they took casualties, but they did not break. The Japanese never got across. Meanwhile, Captain Yosen's guerrillas at the southwestern roadblock were dealing with their own problems. Japanese troops from Cabanatuan City had heard the gunfire and were probing toward the camp. Yosen's bazooka team destroyed the lead vehicle. His guerrillas cut down the infantry following behind. The Japanese withdrew to regroup. The roadblocks held. Because of Pahota and Yosen, because of 275 Filipino fighters who risked everything to save Americans they had never met, the Rangers and prisoners had time to escape. When Prince's second red flare arced into the sky, the signal that the column was a mile from the camp, the guerrillas finally withdrew. They fell back in good order, forming a flank and rear guard for the retreating column. Pahota's action at the Kabu River Bridge killed over 300 Japanese soldiers. His guerrillas suffered 20 wounded. Not a single ranger or prisoner was attacked during the withdrawal. The column stretched for miles through the Philippine darkness. At the front, Rangers guided the way with Filipino scouts. In the middle, carabao carts creaked along dirt roads carrying the weakest prisoners. At the rear, guerrillas watched for pursuers who never came. The original 26 carts had grown to over 100. Filipino civilians from every barrio they passed saw what was happening and volunteered their carts, their carabao, their help. They gave water to the prisoners. They gave food. Some just stood by the road and wept. These weren't just American soldiers being rescued. These were men who had tried to defend the Philippines 3 years earlier, men who had fought and bled and suffered alongside Filipino soldiers at Bataan. Now, finally, they were going home. But the march was agony. 25 miles of dirt roads and river crossings. The prisoners were too weak to walk. Many couldn't sit upright in the carts. The jolting movement over rough terrain reopened wounds and exhausted men who had nothing left. One prisoner, Dr. James Fisher, had been too sick to leave the camp without medical attention. Mucci had ordered an airstrip built near Platero so a plane could evacuate him, but it never arrived. Fisher died the next day. His last words, "Good luck on the way out." Another prisoner died of a heart attack before the column even left the campgrounds. 2 men. After everything they had survived, the death march, the camp, the years of starvation and disease, they died within hours of rescue. But 510 others made it. At dawn on January 31, 1945, the column crossed the Pampanga River and reached American lines at Talavera. Waiting for them was Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, the 6th Army commander who had authorized the mission. He watched the prisoners emerge from the jungle, skeletal figures in rags, blinking in the sunlight, barely able to stand. He wrote later, most of them were in pitiable condition and could not realize they were actually safe. They were safe. After 3 years, they were finally safe. The rescued prisoners were rushed to field hospitals, where Army doctors worked around the clock to treat decades of accumulated damage. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, pellagra, tropical ulcers, malnutrition so severe that organs were failing. Many would require months of treatment before they were healthy enough to travel. But they were alive, and they were going home. On February 11, 1945, 280 of the Cabanatuan survivors boarded the transport USS General A.E. Anderson, bound for the United States. When they sailed into San Francisco Bay, crowds lined the Golden Gate Bridge. Ships in the harbor sounded their horns. Banners hung from buildings. These were the first large group of Pacific POWs to return home, and their stories of the death march, of the camps, of the brutality they had endured shocked the American public. The news spread across the country. Newspapers ran front-page stories about Cabanatuan. Radio programs told the story of the rescue. For the first time, Americans understood what their sons and brothers had suffered in Japanese captivity. And they understood what the Rangers had done to save them. General Douglas MacArthur, in his official report, wrote, "No incident of the campaign in the Pacific has given me such satisfaction as the release of the POWs at Cabanatuan. The mission was brilliantly successful." Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci and Captain Robert Prince received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor. Every other officer received the Silver Star. Every enlisted Ranger received the Bronze Star. The Alamo Scouts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Joson, the Filipino guerrilla leaders whose men had made the rescue possible, were recognized by both the Philippine and American governments for their extraordinary courage. The Great Raid at Cabanatuan is studied today at every military special operations school in the world. It was perfectly planned, perfectly coordinated, perfectly executed. 30 miles behind enemy lines, against overwhelming odds, with no margin for error, and they pulled it off. 512 people rescued. 2 prisoners died during the evacuation. 2 Rangers were killed, one by friendly fire, one by enemy fire during the assault. 20 Filipino guerrillas were wounded. Against those losses, over 530 Japanese killed. The ratio is almost beyond comprehension. But the numbers don't capture what really happened that night. The Rangers didn't rescue statistics. They rescued human beings, fathers, sons, brothers, men who had fought for their country and been abandoned by their country and nearly died forgotten in a jungle prison camp. Private Kittleson, one of the Alamo Scouts who watched the prisoners emerge, never forgot what he saw. "If I was in that camp, I'd sure hope somebody'd come get me." Somebody came. That's what the Rangers did. That's what the guerrillas did. That's what the Filipino civilians who volunteered their carts and their carabao did. They came. Colonel Mucci's words before the mission became legend. Remember, all of the prisoners go. No one is left behind. Not a single one. No one was left behind. And in the Ranger Creed, the code that every Army Ranger memorizes today, you'll find the same commitment. I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. That creed exists in part because of what happened at Cabanatuan on January 30th, 1945. Because 120 men crawled 800 yards across open ground to keep a promise. If this story moved you, if you want to see more incredible moments from military history, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover stories like this every day. And if you haven't seen it yet, check out the video on the USS Johnston, another impossible story of Americans who refused to quit. Thanks for watching.